Thank you. Dr. Medlock, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, a lot of what Mr. Melito said is actually supported to a certain extent by some work that we've been involved with. We recently launched a study looking at the broader impacts of allowing oil export from the United States, and that's actually a smaller part of a broader study that we're looking at to evaluate North American energy security prospects. So this is the idea of regional trade being allowed to flow freely between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and what sort of benefits that could actually convey. In general, when you look at commodity trade, you're talking about, when you talk about oil in particular, and this will address gasoline prices, a market between oil and gasoline that's vertically integrated effectively. So we use oil to produce gasoline. So if you pinch one market or constrain one market, the arbitrage opportunity moves downstream to the next one. And so what this means is if we constrain the flow of exports of crude oil, what we'll see is a discount domestically, and that's exactly what we've seen. But as long as the product price is arbitraged internationally, then you'll see that price fluctuate according to international supply-demand fundamentals. And so that's exactly what we've seen. And if you look at pad-level data for gasoline prices in the United States and other petroleum product prices, you do see that disconnect is transmitted in so much as we've seen, for example, in the ability to move crude away from WTI. Now, of course, historically, over the last few years, this has not been an export-driven issue. This has been an infrastructure-driven issue. But that disconnect, nevertheless, has led to a discount of WTI relative to Brent. And you see that disconnect or that discount being conveyed from WTI into product prices. And so what that means is the product prices are not falling coincidentally with WTI. So what that tells you is that refiners, in fact, are not passing the price, the discount along. Now, that sounds like a really sort of almost negative statement, but in point of fact, what we're talking about is we have downstream a market that is internationally fungible. And that is a really critical point. And so what that means is that the price movements internationally will affect the product price movements here, not the domestic crude price. And again, this is just a standard sort of protocol when you start to look at how commodity prices are influenced by different market behaviors and market constraints. Now, when you move beyond understanding what might happen to gasoline prices, and importantly, it's sort of logical to follow the step. Well, what happens if we lift the ban on crude oil exports? And the next logical step would be, well, you're actually pushing more light tight oil or light sweet crude into the global marketplace, and presumably that could actually put downward pressure on the price of light sweet crude, which is, that's the barrel at the margin. So that is the barrel that's helping determine the price of products. The problem with making a just sort of grand statement like that is that qualitatively, while that's true, quantitatively it's difficult to assess because there will be market responses by other participants. In particular, you can't predict exactly what OPEC will do. The one thing we can't say for certain, though, because there really is no paradigm in any sort of economic principles or economic framework that I can think of in which allowing exports of crude oil in the international market actually raise the price of crude oil. That simply won't happen. But point estimates on declines, that's a difficult thing to do. With regard to energy security, because this is another really major sort of broader issue that kind of fits into the context overall of something I mentioned a minute ago about North American energy security. Go back to the 1970s. You mentioned in your opening statements about the acts that were actually passed to sort of ban the export of crude oil. Well, when you do this, you quickly begin to realize that, while well-intentioned, those policies didn't necessarily convey the benefits that they were meant to convey. In particular, when you look at a very deep literature on this issue, and why do we think about energy security in the context of oil prices? Well, because every recession except for one since World War II has been preceded by a run-up in the price of crude oil. Just a very standard, simple correlation. Now, it doesn't convey causation, but the idea is you want to shield consumers domestically from shocks related to macroeconomic shocks that can be related to run-ups in the price of crude. Well, one of the things that actually falls out of the literature are a number of different potential channels through which prices transmit to the macroeconomy, and one of these is through the trade balance. And so if you actually allow for exports of light sweet crude, which is a higher valued crude slate than the heavy sours that we typically import into the Gulf Coast, for example, you're actually giving a net positive benefit to the trade balance, and it actually conveys an energy security benefit, not necessarily an energy security cost. So these sorts of things have to be brought into discussion. These are the kinds of things that we're actually actively looking at right now in order to try to really understand what changing the existing paradigm or the status quo will mean longer term, not only for gasoline prices, but more broadly for U.S. energy security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Medlock. I want to thank all our panelists. I'll yield 5 minutes to myself for questions. Mr. Medlock, Mr. Jennings on your far right there runs a refinery. He says it's going to cost him 10 to 15 cents more to refine gasoline if we lift the ban. What do you think about that?
Well, I think undoubtedly if we lift the ban, domestic price of crude will go up, and so that will actually affect the bottom line of any refinery, particularly those that are processing light sweet crude. So the cost to refine crude will certainly rise, but the price of the finished products themselves are still going to be determined in our national marketplace. It's fully fungible because there are no barriers to trade there.
All right, let me be more specific. He said gasoline prices at his refinery would go up 10 to 15 cents if we lift the ban. And he'd lay off, yeah, I forget how many workers. He mentioned a lot of workers. So weigh in on that. And keep it simple, Mr. Medlock. Your testimony is complicated.
Well,
keep it simple.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The issue, in all fairness, though, is not quite so simple. But in point of fact, we export products today, and we see healthier margins today at refineries because not only do we have cheap crude domestically because of the onset of production that we've seen in the last 4 to 5 years. But we also have cheap natural gas, which actually helps the bottom line of refineries. And we also have an excess of refining capacity relative to what we consume because demand today is lower than it was in 2006, 2007, and 2008. All three of those things, coupled with the closure of refineries overseas, have really helped propel the U.S. refining industry into a sort of new paradigm, one in which we're actually exporting as much finished product today as we did just back in 2006, or in terms of what we imported in 2006. So when you look at that and you combine all those factors together, yes, exporting crude oil will raise the price of crude oil to refineries, but those other benefits are still there. So it's not clear to me that refiners will actually be forced to shut down. Their bottom lines will be affected, but whether or not they close and end up laying people off is a completely different issue.
Mr. Melito, I have a couple of questions for you. The chairman mentioned the Keystone XL pipeline and the glut of crude oil coming into the United States. How would that affect any of this, if it would?
It's huge. We're looking to have a market in North America that works efficiently together. And a lot of the refiners, particularly in the Gulf Coast, have reconfigured and made upgrades to take on the heavier crudes. That would naturally come through the Keystone XL pipeline from our friendly trading partner to the north. So infrastructure is a very important component of this whole debate, and we need to make sure we're moving forward in a way to capitalize on these infrastructure opportunities because they alone create a lot of jobs. Our country is projected over the next 12 or 13 years to put more than $1 trillion into infrastructure projects because of this oil and gas renaissance. So we shouldn't turn our eye to that opportunity.
The Keystone XL pipeline is supposed to come down to Port Arthur, Texas. I used to represent all those refineries. Mr. Weber now represents them all.
Amen.
But let me ask you another question about the Middle East, kind of a policy, and anybody can weigh in on this. So we lift the ban, so to speak. How does that affect us energy-wise and politically with the Middle East? Because that's, when we talk about the Middle East, everybody talks about making them irrelevant, because of their situation, but they hold a lot of the crude oil we get. Politically and economically, would this affect our relationship with the Middle East? Anybody can weigh in on this.
Well, I'm sure Dr. Medlock has some input on that, but one thing I would point to is the need for us as a nation to look at energy security and link it to foreign policy. Those two need to be addressed holistically and from just a fundamental standpoint. If we are taking down the walls that we have that are right now up along our coast to exports, whether it's LNG, crude oil, we are sending a pretty strong signal to those around the world that we're going to play as an energy superpower like we should. So we're sending a signal, and we're also putting more supplies into the marketplace and creating a better scenario. The production we've had in this huge increase where we've gone from 5 to 8 million barrels a day has allowed the global market to be able to absorb and have a greater cushion when you're looking at things like Iran sanctions and things like that. So it's a huge benefit to energy security when we're able to push more supplies into the global market. But like I said, I think Dr. Medlock probably has a lot smarter answer than that.
And also, Dr. Medlock, while you're answering that question, I've always thought that the United States, Canada, and Mexico, we ought to work together on energy issues, energy independence, energy security, economically. Are we doing that any better than we have in the past? Make it quick if you can, please.
Yeah, great question. On the issue of the Middle East, they will never be irrelevant. It's too large an energy exporter into the global marketplace, and we're not the only consumer in the world. So when you talk about a globally interconnected marketplace, they're going to matter no matter what we do. With regard to U.S., Canada, and Mexico, I would say we're not actually optimizing the relationships that we have with Canadians and the Mexicans. And we're presented with some actually new real opportunities. And one of those north of the border would be with regard to the development of the oil sands production opportunities and moving that oil via pipeline instead of by rail or somewhere else where it's actually going to be at a cost disadvantage relative to moving it here. So it's going to be more polluting, which ironically is exactly what is trying to be prevented. So with regard to Mexico, in terms of what's happening with energy reform there's tremendous opportunity to deepen the energy trade relationship with that country, particularly as it begins to open up their upstream sector to foreign investment.
Thank you. I will yield 5 minutes to the ranking member.
A number of our witnesses talk about energy abundance, quote General Dempsey about how we're going to have world power by being a net energy exporter. I think we're getting a little carried away. It's nice to be producing more, but the chances that we export more petroleum than we import are roughly the same as the Vladimir Putin winning a Nobel Peace Prize. We're talking here about a country that's going to be importing more than it exports for a long, long time to come. I'm going to pose one question for the record just because I don't know if you've come here to, you're prepared to answer it, and that is, we could export 1 billion barrels and import 1 billion barrels, and maybe it'd say, hey, that's about the same. Except it offers an opportunity to play tax shenanigans with both the billion coming in and the billion going out. So what are the opportunities for U.S. energy producers to classify their income as earned in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland on these exports? And could this be a game where we're just kind of moving things around? It doesn't have much effect, except we lose an awful lot of tax revenue. I'm also going to be posing that question to people who are tax experts as well. But if the major effect of this is to introduce tax shenanigans into moving 1 billion barrels from here to there and from there to here, I think we ought to be very wary of that. Now, it's my understanding that we can export refined petroleum products without legal restriction. Is that correct? I'm seeing nodding. Most natural resource producers in the world say, we don't want to just have you come here and take our potash. We don't want to just have you come here and mine this or that. We want the manufacturing, or at least the processing jobs. Why can we not achieve what we want to achieve just by keeping the refinery creation and operation jobs here and exporting the refined product? Why do we need to be exporting the petroleum? Ms. Gordon?
So about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, before light tight oil was really on anyone's radar screen, and even EIA missed it, everyone missed it. And there are reasons why separately I can discuss, but the move was made to change the entire refining sector to deal with what oil we thought was going to be the last oil on earth, this heavier barrel. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a situation where billions have been put into U.S. refineries, all up and down the Mississippi and into the Gulf, that handle selectively best they're complex refineries, and they handle the extra heavy oil.
So we would want to somehow acquire heavy oil for those refineries.
Yes, and the prospects for Canada.
And whether we burn that ourselves or whether we export the refined product, we want to keep those special refineries refining what they were built for.
And those refineries make diesel. They make more diesel, and diesel, goes to your question, has a very high export value. Mm-hmm. We're exporting a tremendous amount of diesel. The light tight oils that now we found out we have, and we don't really yet have the refining capacity for, make preferentially gasoline, which is the product we use. So you can imagine ships crossing in the night, you know, with all of this global trade where oil will go one way, it will get refined someplace else, the product will come back.
How dangerous is it to transport refined petroleum products?
I think it's just more a matter of what you're saying before, economic value. There's always a risk whenever you're putting
But
things.
it's no more dangerous than, I mean, we know unrefined petroleum can stain beaches. I assume that the refined petroleum is not explosive.
No, it would be the same contamination that you would have if it opened up on, although the extra heavy oil might be very different. When it spilled into the Mississippi, the extra heavy oil sinks. So it's a little bit different.
Well, real quickly on that, the recent incident in Galveston in the Houston Ship Channel was related to a fuel oil spill. That was a refined product spill. So, and in terms of the cost of transporting of products, it is different because the flash points are different for refined products than they are for raw crudes. And so, this goes back to the point about, you remember the train incident that happened.
But we're talking about $1 a barrel difference or 20 cents a barrel
huge.
difference. Okay,
The biggest
very,
cost
very
is-
small
the
compared
biggest
to the
cost
value
that Barbara was talking, Ms. Gordon was talking about, was really related to stranded costs that refiners would be forced to deal with if they're forced to actually go in and reconfigure to handle the crudes that are being produced here.
My time has expired.
Thank the ranking member. We'll turn to Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Just a myriad of questions here. I just want to maybe go back to this last question about refined as opposed to unrefined. It seems to me that the refined product would be more dangerous maybe to the environment if it would spill as opposed to crude oil that comes from the ground, comes from the earth. But if I'm wrong, am I wrong? Or it makes no difference whatsoever. We don't care whether we spill gasoline or oil or crude oil. It's all the same.
Well, it's all
refined
hydrocarbon.
product will evaporate if spilled, and crude oil will not. So there is a difference.
But which one's worse?
Well, worse to the water would be the crude oil, which would be residual in the water. Worse to the air would be...
Doesn't it come out of the ground on the California coast, the crude oil? Doesn't it bubble up out of the surface of the ocean? So,
But there's a difference between a naturally occurring seep and a spill. A naturally occurring seep is actually part of a local ecosystem that has evolved over thousands of years typically, whereas when you talk about a spill, it's an introduction of a raw crude into an area that's not equipped to cope with it. So it is different.
okay.
And I just wanted to add, because oils are now so different from each other, we still talk about it as oil coming out of the ground, but the light tight oils, some of them, especially coming out of Eagle Ford in Texas, are so light, they're condensate. And that's what Senator Murkowski was talking about, maybe trying to change the definition of oil. And some of the oils coming out of the ground in Venezuela and Canada are so heavy, they're on their way to coal. So we're talking about the definition of oil, hydrocarbons, really changing, where it's not necessarily one thing anymore. It's a collective of a lot of different hydrocarbon arrangements.
Okay. Can anybody talk to the questions regarding some of the boutique fuels that the federal government requires refiners to make? Is there any difference or any considerations in that regarding exporting, importing light crude, heavy, sour, sweet, and our refining capacity in the United States?
The refining system in the United States is obviously capable of making the different boutique fuels that are required in different markets throughout the country. They relate to principally the vapor pressure, how volatile the material is, octane, and now sulfur content is a big focus. The international standard often requires the tighter end of those specifications, and so the export barrels typically will be those that would qualify for the most stringent U.S. markets as well.
At what point in this discussion are producers going to leave the oil in the ground? Are we already doing that because refining capacity doesn't exist? Is that already occurring now? And if it isn't, at what point would that occur? Will it never occur?
It will certainly occur if the discounts actually get to be sufficient enough. I mean, currently, and there are a couple of different things that are working against this. It's not just an export issue, it's also an infrastructure issue because currently in the Bakken, for example, in North Dakota, we move a lot of that crude by rail, which is an order of magnitude more expensive than moving it by pipeline. And this goes back to, getting the appropriate infrastructure in place, and there's obviously a policy overlay here. But if you were to actually have the pipeline infrastructure in place, that crude effectively the net back to the wellhead would be priced $18 to $20 higher, and so that buys a lot of a lot more activity in the field. So it's, I hate to focus this only on the export issue because it's broader than that. It actually is, it matriculates down into the infrastructure to move away from the wellhead. And moving crude by rail is a lot more expensive than moving it by pipe.
I was just going to add, because it came up, the consumers and the economy, of course, with oil and gasoline comes up all the time. These oils, if they're stranded in the ground, it will be because the price is too low. It will take a much higher price. So we're talking about more abundance at a high price. This is so different than the 1970s, where we were talking very low prices and then supply was getting stuck. This is a lot of capacity, physical capacity of hydrocarbons in the earth that can get out of the ground if the price gets really high. So we'll see volatility in the market, but it's going to have to trend upward to get these oils out of the market and move them around and refine them.
And if I could add, looking at the study we have, it shows that with the lifting of the crude export restrictions, we could see additional production of up to 500,000 barrels. So just put two and two together. That's because there's now an opportunity, because we have a new market to take that product to. But at the same time, that impact on production is pretty significant. You would see those jobs go into places like Pennsylvania, California, Texas, that are heavy in manufacturing and production, not just production of oil, but also on the manufacturing side.
So we've got a couple refineries down in the Philadelphia area, Marcus Hook, that were in peril just a year or two ago. If refineries like the ones that you are familiar with, and those in particular in Pennsylvania, had to change around, what would be the time frame to change around to refine the oil that we're talking about coming out of the United States?
Well,
those refineries are very well suited to the light U.S. crudes that are being produced in the Bakken and other places, the condensates from the Marcellus and the Utica shales. They are at risk in the advent of crude exports, and the reason being, if it can go to the East Coast by rail or otherwise and load onto a ship at the Brent price, they're going to lose access to that advantaged barrel of crude oil. So they're sort of a poster child for reasons to retain that domestic U.S. manufacturing capacity and the security of being able to produce our own refined products versus export it.
And this is a very innovative industry, as we know, and that's a fantastic thing, actually. So these constraints lead to changes. BP is building the first splitter refinery in Houston that's going to be able to handle light tight oils and extra heavy oils. Exxon is building a refinery, a petrochemical refinery in Indonesia that's going to be able to handle the gamut of these oils. So somehow we're going to have to figure out how to manage all of these oils and not just kind of split up, or I would argue against changing the definition of oil, because you're going to have to deal with a whole array of hydrocarbons in the future.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
All right. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel. Appreciate your testimony. Mr. Jennings, you were saying oil price is dictated by OPEC. Is that correct? The OPEC market?
Significantly induced.
Is it possible for the U.S. to produce enough oil with our allies to set the world oil prices, breaking OPEC's monopoly?
I think that would take many years. The U.S. still imports 6-7 million barrels per day.
All right, but if we increased our production along with our allies, it's possible, right?
It is possible, yes.
Would breaking the OPEC's monopoly stabilize the sharp spikes we see, especially in the Middle East, when you have a ruler or a dictator, they get an upset stomach or gas, and they threaten to close one of the straits there? I mean, would that stabilize the price of oil?
Yeah, the Middle East is still producing and exporting 10 to 15 million barrels per day of oil. Even with what we and our North American allies could do, I don't believe in the near future, in our lifetimes, we're going to offset that effect.
But it's possible. And if we don't prepare, if I look back to when Bill Clinton was in office and he had the opportunity to build that pipeline, but he said that would take 10 years, wouldn't help us. That 10 years has come and gone by a factor of about 2.5 to 3. We would have had that extra stability in a supply that we do not have today. So if we prepare today, it would be possible in the future, correct?
Absolutely. The infrastructure and the production capacity is critical. I mean, if you take the other end of the spectrum, the Canadians are going to solve their own problem, and they'll go east to New Brunswick and off on a boat, or west to British Columbia to China.
And we don't want that.
And we don't want that. None of us want that.
We don't want that. We can't use oil or the petroleum products as a strategic diplomatic tool if we do not update our export oil policies. And I, for one, will support the repeal of this policy to increase the ability for us to export so that we can use that as a bargaining chip. Chip, Mr. Melito and Dr. Medlock, do you feel it's possible for us to achieve energy security in the U.S.?
I think we're doing that right now with this tremendous advance in production that we're seeing. Going from 5 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day in just a few years is incredible. Nobody would have imagined that. Same on the natural gas side. We're expected to import $100 billion a year in natural gas, and now we're looking to export. So,
well, I mean, that's just it. I mean, 10 years ago, we're going to have to export all this, but through technology and better techniques, we're going to be a net exporter. Do you feel like we could be a net exporter on petroleum products, too?
We're on our way there as well. If you look at the volume of petroleum refined product that we're moving now, that alone is having a huge dent on our trade deficit. So the refiners are performing at a high level, high capacity, and they're helping us on an energy security front.
All right, and moving crude by pipeline is more economical, it's more efficient. That's what you were saying, correct?
Yes.
Versus rail or truck?
It is much less expensive.
And if we moved it that way, it would be better for the environment, so we're not driving trains and trucks around, correct?
That's correct.
So do you see any reason not to build the pipeline?
No.
Thank you. Dr. Gordon, you said we should go slow at not upsetting the world producers to give them time to adjust. Would an increase in the supply stabilize the price, in your opinion? Microphone, please.
Sorry. What's happening in the U.S. is we're the biggest consumer, and now we're becoming a very big producer. So we're in the position of being the only nation on earth that's almost equal parts producer and consumer, which puts us in a very unusual situation compared to everyone else around the globe, which is either much more a producer or much more a consumer. China, Saudi Arabia. So we just have, the go slow is to figure out what this means at home, for us.
I think what it means to me is I sleep better at night knowing that we can produce our needs and where we're not dependent as much on foreign oil. And so I think the more we can do that, it would increase our security in the nation, stabilize our markets. Because what I see is I come from a strong agricultural background. Every time the price of oil goes up, and I remember when we were buying diesel for $5 a gallon in my truck, the price of everything went up immediately. And the sharp spikes are what disrupted the economy. If we can stabilize that with a steady supply from our allies to the north, and maybe Mexico, and we can stabilize that here, it'll stabilize our economy. And if we have a stabilized economy, we have an economic engine that we need to protect. Oil will be shipped where it's needed from countries that produce it to those where the market is needed. And if that's the case, I say if we have the market and we have the supply, I think we need to ship it because it'll create tax revenues for this country, and I think America can do it better than anybody else. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Wow. Do any of y'all know what the percentage of plants, there's about 130, 140 refineries across the country. Does that sound about right? What percentage of those refineries are set to do light crude, and what percentage are set to do just heavy crude, and then what percentage are set to do both?
First, I want to dispel the myth that it's just light or just heavy. Inside every heavy refinery is a light plant where you're going to not use the full kit. Okay, so these plants can refine light crude, but not on an optimized basis. They don't fully use all the capital. Probably half to 5/8 of our country's refining capacity has capability to cut deeper into the heavy and sour barrel and make gasoline and diesel out of it, and the remaining 30-40% doesn't have that capacity. What I would say, though, is that's a snapshot at a point in time. There's a lot of investment being made, condensate splitters, other things that plants are doing. We had one in Cheyenne, Wyoming, that was almost 100% running heavy Canadian. Now we run 50% Canadian, 50% light Bakken. So I hope I answered your question quantitatively, but I want to leave you with the impression that things are changing because investments are being made toward the new light crude slate.
Right. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Yes, ma'am.
There's a new CRS report that just came out last week that actually has the map of the world, a map of the country broken down. It's very different by pad. You know, some districts are much better suited to, you know, the different types of refineries. But I have that. I could show it to you after if you want to see it.
Okay, and that was my next question. You're reading my notes up here, I guess. I hope that person's okay. It shows the map of the United States by location. Of course, I'm from the Texas Gulf Coast, as Judge Poe was saying, and the Keystone Pipeline does come into my district. And the discussion you're hearing is exactly correct. We can move oil safer, 99% safety rating via the pipeline industry, and we can produce it in Texas and export it if should the need arise. It's going to impact some of the refineries, Mr. Jennings. I get that, and I'm interested in that percentage. And of course, I'm interested in what's in Texas and specifically what's in my district. One of you said we have excess refining capacity, and my question is how much?
Currently, the United States is exporting about 1.5 million barrels per day on a net basis of refined petroleum products.
We're exporting 1.5 million, but how much refining capacity does that give us? I'm not following.
Refineries are running in the low 90s in terms of their capacity. They might be able to eke out 2% additional, so that would be another 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day. What I would tell you is the refining system is fully utilized, but we are accessing about 1.5 million barrels a day to export markets for refined products.
Does that also include the pipeline? I know that we move product back and forth. If we get the Keystone Pipeline approved, does that increase our capacity? We move product back and forth. If we get the Keystone Pipeline approved, does that increase our capacity?
That allows us to run different crude oil. It is a crude pipeline as opposed to a refined product pipeline.
I got you. And when we're running those pipelines, what we're seeing with the natural gas boom, if you will, we're getting a lot of liquids. You talk about dehydrogenation or what's the word? Hydration. Thank you. And so we're seeing ethanes and methanes. We're seeing propanes and butanes, and a lot of that is being able to be taken out. So we also get a side market. This is not just about the crude per se. And if we think that, am I correct in saying that had we been able to have all these pipelines in place and supplying propane, for example, to the Northeast, more so this past winter, that they'd have had a bit more of a comfortable heating season, economically speaking? Is that fair to say?
Well, I would be cautious about that because typically you don't build pipelines to peak because then you've got unutilized infrastructure 90% of the time. Propane historically has been distributed by truck, not by pipeline.
Well, I know they've got to get it close so that they can distribute it, but that would have helped.
But the issue this winter was it was a record cold winter. I mean, that has to be recognized in that, somewhere in the context of this.
Right.
So.
Well, there are those who tell you that the climate is changing, and I agree with that. I think it changes 4 times a year, but nonetheless. And so you wouldn't argue with the fact that people over in the Ukraine would rather be buying our natural gas and conceivably our oil than they would be getting energy from Russia, right?
At the moment, yeah, but I think in general they'd just be happy buying something that was low cost and available.
As would Japan and some of the others. Yeah. So, all right, well, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair recognizes ranking member.
Yeah, I don't know if we're planning to do another round, but I've just got a question or two. I'd point out on the idea of the Ukraine. They can't afford to pay Russia $10 a unit. Japan pays us or is paying 16. So if we were exporting natural gas, the Japanese would be offering far more than the Ukrainians could afford to pay, unless we want to tax the American people more so that we can provide a $6 a unit. I have 1 or 2 questions for Ms. Gordon. The first is, let's say we go ahead and we export everything without limits. Then there's another 1973 and we want to hoard what we've got. Will we have the infrastructure to process the oil we produce and use it ourselves if we spend a decade exporting what we export, what the market says to export, and importing what the market says to import?
Yeah, it's a really good question because the more that the market's constrained here with these different and new oils coming out of the ground, the more we're going to think about infrastructure solutions for those here. If it's more profitable to just offshore them, then Saudi Arabia is going to build the refining infrastructure capacity, which is what they're trying to do. The Middle East is getting into refining big time. So, in a way, it's a prize, too. Of course, it's economic to unload it as a producer, but there's a prize here in terms of figuring out how to do it. And that is a question. We will lose that ground when we export.
Prevail on the chairman to ask me to let you ask just one question. The dream of environmentalists I know is that the tar sands of Canada are never exploited. There are those who say they'll build the pipeline, the Keystone. The environmentalists think they can stop that. There are those who say the Canadians will go east or west. There are Canadian environmentalists who are in touch with my California environmentalists who think they can stop that. How uneconomic is it to put that Canadian oil into tanker cars, take it on railroads to a U.S. domestic pipeline, and then have it proceed? In other words, if the environmentalists stop the Keystone pipe, stop any pipeline, any Canadian pipeline, and they stop any international U.S. pipeline, can domestic U.S. pipelines bring that oil to market economically, although at lower profits to those who own the tar sands?
Well, it's pretty powerful. The investments up there, at least for the mined bitumen, which has all been invested, it wants to get out, and it will do so at a lower profit if it means mothballing everything that's ready to get out there. So right now it's moving by rail. I think it's Valero. Can't remember someone's put in a variance actually that would take rail bit, which is the slightly diluted bitumen that you put on rail, and then it would just put it right onto a tanker, so it would come through. The variance would be, is this even U.S. oil? I mean, are we just exporting foreign oil out of Texas by putting Canadian oil unprocessed?
Bottom line, that Canadian oil...
Putting Canadian oil unprocessed.
Bottom line, that Canadian oil... and leaving that tar sand in the ground, and do I have that right?
Yes, for the mined bitumen, which is about 20% of the resource, because all of that investment's been made. Big question mark for the in situ, the really deep bitumen that they'd have to heat out of the ground. It might be that investments aren't made if it's difficult to move it to market. And then the big question about the oil sands is, what do you do with the bottom of the barrel? If we could think of a way to get rid of that pet coke, the bottom of the barrel, they really wouldn't be that different from any other oil. It's just that they have a very large bottom of the barrel.
The environmentalists I know are opposed to any
well, I'll just add a comment to that as the debate about Keystone has raged, oil sands production has increased.
The difference in price to ship crude by rail versus pipeline from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico is only about $6 a barrel, $6 a barrel. That isn't going to go into the producer's decision-making of whether or not to develop incremental oil sands capacity.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. I want to thank our four witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, can I follow that up?
No, you're not recognized. The chair appreciates all four of you being here and working with you, and I want to thank the staff on both sides for getting us excellent expert witnesses on this issue, and look forward to talking to you as we progress on legislation, if any. Committee's adjourned.